Happy Easter. We come to Monday of the third week of the New Testament by Pentecost reading challenge. Christ is risen. Christ is risen indeed. Today we turn to an epistle that asks, what difference does that make? The dating of James is widely disputed. Some argue it's actually older than Paul's letters. Others date it to the early 100s. It's written to the 12 tribes of Diaspora. Diaspora is a word used for Jews living in scattered lands, but this letter is a distinctly Christian document. That suggests it was written not to Jewish believers in general, but to Christ followers living in scattered places. Tradition long held that this was written by James, the brother of Jesus, who is mentioned in Galatians and elsewhere as the leader of the Jerusalem Christ community. If that were accurate, this could be a very early letter. James the Just, as he was also known, was executed in the early 60s. However, the author's use of Greek language and grammar is quite sophisticated. Not impossible for the brother of Jesus from the peasant class whose native language was Aramaic, but at least somewhat unlikely. Further, the author does not refer to himself as Jesus' brother, which would seem probable if it were so. Borg places it here, in the 70s, after Mark but before Matthew, for two reasons. First, its material seems like early tradition, but it also reflects the strife of a dividing society, with Christ followers increasingly excluded from the synagogues. And two, because of how James' use of sayings of Jesus is quite similar to Matthew and Luke, but not exactly like them, suggesting an emergent tradition around these sayings. More on that idea later in the week. This is not a typical letter. It lacks both a specific address and a traditional closing. Instead, the text has much in common with Old Testament wisdom literature, being focused not on theological concepts and doctrine, but on how one lives a life of faith. The language of the way is quite similar to what we saw in the Gospel of Mark. If Mark was about the reader responding to Jesus' message, James is about how that looks lived out. It's largely a collection of practical advice and imperatives, full of contrast indicating ways of life that are from God and of the world. Note that this world is not suggesting that creation itself is evil, but that the humanly created social world of greed and violence is not godly. James has the most quotations of Jesus of any New Testament text outside the Gospels. Its imagery focuses on economic themes, with frequent condemnations of the rich. Borg suggests this may be one reason this letter is often considered scandalous and is so difficult to read in our society. The letter of James fascinates me. Martin Luther dismissed it as an epistle of straw and even suggested leaving it out of the scriptures altogether, while John Wesley preached from it often and found it central to Christian life. Their different reactions may have as much to do with the state of the church in their different times as it does the book itself. Luther was right to decry an over-reliance on practices like indulgence, but I think that concern blinded him to much of what James has to say. Wesley's day had seen a 180-degree shift from Luther's. More intellectual assent being emphasized, and that was all that was required, that you said you believed or your name was on a pew. Didn't really matter what you did. James' fiery and passionate call for action, rooted in faith, informed Wesley's urging of transformed lives of service. We've seen in Paul's letters this same tension between trusting in Christ alone as opposed to trying to earn our own salvation with human works. The author of this letter emphasizes that a faith that does not affect how one lives and leads to action is really no faith at all. How will God speak to you on your journey through these words? Blessing on your reading, and happy Easter.